Folks, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on corporate governance. If one looks at the world today, corporate governance is assuming much greater importance. It has been very important for the last many years, but we are facing new challenges. And I want to talk on some of those new challenges. I think the most important challenge that many companies are facing is succession planning. How do you ensure that every listed corporation has a proper succession plan in place and the board is cognizant of its responsibility and make sure that it actually happens? And the reason is very clear. We are in the midst of the digital revolution. Stability in the global economy is low. Disruption is very high. New business models are coming into play. There is disruptive capital happening in a big way. Corporations have to respond to changes in the marketplace, changes in competition, and new business models coming up. Now, when all these challenges are there has to be stability at the top. There has to be proper successors. Earlier, most CEOs could look forward to 10 to 15 years of rule at the top. But today, if they're able to be successful for 5 to 7 years, I would consider it a big achievement. So I would think that the most important thing is to have succession planning. And for succession planning, the board has to make sure that the corporate strategy for the next 3 to 5 years is in place. And then decide what kind of person is required to execute the corporate strategy. Then look at the present incumbent and others down the line and decide for themselves whether they are the people to take the corporation forward. If they believe that is so, then they have to have a process of grooming to make sure that the people that they think are good for the corporation for the next 10 years are put into place. And whenever the CEO's terms comes up, they must evaluate the CEO's position and performance in a very transparent manner and make sure that they discharge the fiduciary obligation. In very many boards, CEOs run the corporation and persuade the boards to give them higher compensation using fear as a weapon. So the board has to step in at that point of time, especially the lead independent director, and use that time to make sure that they have people in place. The board also has to make sure that for 2 levels below the CEO, there's a proper appraisal and creation of a management team. Very often in major corporations where there's a superstar, the superstar makes sure that people in the next 2 levels do not have the ability to come up to need. It's happened in many cases. There are multiple examples all across the world. And that is why putting in processes on the team is extremely important. The board also has to decide whether the CEO's successor will be an insider or an outsider. And the decision has to be taken well in time. It cannot be taken just before a CEO's term comes up for renewal, or it cannot be taken just when there's a crisis in the company or the potential crisis. So I would suggest that maybe 6 to 8 months before a CEO's term comes up for renewal, the board should evaluate and come to a position, then work with the CEO to either have a transition or to make sure that they have a person who can come in and join the corporation CEO time. Stability at the top is extremely important. And at the next 2 levels also put in a process to mentor people, and maybe at the next level evaluate their performance every 6 months to the nomination committee to make sure. Because stability at the top at the time when global markets are unstable, there's going to be rapid transformation and disruption is extremely important. And I would think there's a key role for the board to play. I would also think that there are other areas where the board has to step in and to work, which are going to be extremely important in future. And that is, once again, composition of the board. The board members are fiduciary agents. The board should have majority of independent directors. Now, what is independence? Independence is when board members evaluate the performance of the corporation, the strategic direction, and the CEO's performance with a merit-based approach, rather than be carried away by the CEO or anybody else. A merit-based approach clearly requires that the CEO's targets and objectives be clearly laid down and evaluated with hard facts and numbers. Of course, there are situations when the CEO and the corporation will not be able to meet the targets. So long as they've done their best and the board is able to come to the conclusion, it is fine. But setting targets for the next 2 or 3 years through a rolling plan is important, because many decisions taken today take 2 or 3 years to play fully, and you just cannot decide on the spur of the moment. So there has to be strategic direction and the strategic plan. And based on that, the goal sheet for the CEO has to be done. Now, when the independent directors can evaluate that honestly and fairly, I think they would have done their job. They also have to make sure the succession planning is done with a objective-based view based on data and hard facts. Because the independent directors also have to make sure that whenever there is a need for them to step in, they do step in. Let me give some examples. A board's need is felt keenly when there is a succession planning to be done and the CEO succession. Like I explained earlier, the board's role is played keenly when there's a regulatory action against the corporation, when the regulators or the government or any other crisis of the regulatory area comes up. The board's action is required when the CEO suddenly resigns for personal reasons or something else. And the board action is required when the CEO gets tainted by something like a sexual harassment action or something like that, which does taint the CEO because of personal action. That's the time when the board has to step in. And also when there's a crisis globally in business. We remember the global financial crisis when boards had to step in and change the CEO because the CEOs, by their greed, had exposed the corporation to multiple risks, and the board had got along. So that is the time when the independence of the directors will be tested. That's the time when the capability has to be tested. So you need to make sure that you are truly independent people who can speak their views, who are extremely competent, who are subject matter experts in the board as independent directors. And you have to accept the fact that people will have multiple views. And of course, the lead independent director has to work to create a consensus. Having multiple independent views does not mean that everybody is a dissenter and ask them to record their dissent. That's not the way it works. Everybody should express their views. A consensus should be built up. And sometimes the consensus could be against your views. And I think you should go along unless it is so very germane to your beliefs that you cannot accept it, in which case you must step down and maybe announce to everybody that you had a difference in the board and you stepped down, and the board can make a statement that we had a difference on strategy and the board took an appropriate decision and we parted ways amicably. All parting has to be amicable. And that is the true role of independent director. But then the lead independent director has a role to play, especially the chairman is an insider or a part of the controlling shareholders' interest or the CEO. In that case, the lead independent director has to create a consensus among the board, make sure that every board member speaks and every board member articulates their views, and a healthy debate is there with all facts and figures. Because we must go on the assumption that all independent board members are objective, database, go by facts and figures and not by any biases, even though human beings do have biases. All of us have biases, in fact, but I'm sure we can get over that. Then the board has to be diverse to meet everybody's need. There has to be appropriate representation of gender, appropriate representation of various facets of work, like having a legal expert, a financial expert, an expert on strategy, an expert who knows the business inside out, etc., who work. And the board has to have a mix of younger and senior people. You cannot have a board with only senior people, because in an era where there is rapid change and transformation, you need younger people. Efforts must be made to bring down the average age of the board to what I would suggest maybe 45 years. And why 45 years? When you are in an era where there's going to be rapid change, you are subject to market forces which could change. And unless you understand the import of the market changes and articulate that and advise the board appropriately, you will not have good strategy. And the board does have to play a role in the corporation strategy, especially for listed companies. Diverse point of view on the board. And the board also has to make sure they have an appropriate policy for reappointment of independent directors. And reappointment should be based upon an objective criteria. That means each independent director should also have a goal sheet where they promise to spend the time required, they promise to participate and to suggest things, and their performance is evaluated by their peers. The good practice is to make sure that every year there's an independent evaluation of all the directors by others, by the peers, based upon the objective criteria, and it is given in strict conference to lead independent director, who should, of course, not tell people what others thought of them, then people will be very cagey, but to do it on a confidential basis where they give feedback to every independent directors and suggest areas of action. And even for the lead independent director, there will be a performance. And at the end of it, when the term for reappointment comes up, that data should be used for the board to suggest whether the independent director will be reappointed or not. And that's the way governance has to be, because everybody has to be performance-based. Becoming a lead independent director is not a guarantee you're going to be there for 9 years or whatever the term you could be appointed, that you get reappointed every single time. You have to perform. And it also means that you need to be compensated adequately for your performance. And you have a fiduciary obligation, a legal obligation, a moral obligation, and that I think is extremely important for all members to do. And boards have to demonstrate to the shareholders and to the investing public, they indeed take the responsibility very seriously, and they do it using a proper structure where evaluation is there, and they proceed on merit and not create an old boys club or an old girls club where only those known to them are there. And when you have a diverse board, which is independent, you must have geographical diversification too. I noticed that in many, many boards, the norm is to have people who are from the same area, who are colleagues of the same place, come from the same city, etc. You should have diversity if you have business across geographies, and make sure that you have voices from all the areas where you do the majority of business. Even if you're only India-based, there's no point having a board with only people from Mumbai, which I see very clearly that for many people, everybody is from Mumbai and a great majority from Mumbai, even though they have business all over India. So gender, independence, qualification, diversity of thought, diversity of geography are extremely important. And this has to be fostered by evaluation, by the peers, peer review, and by making sure that there is feedback for everybody, and then reporting in the corporate governance chapter of the annual report, and maybe in the shareholders meeting telling the shareholders what you've done as independent directors, and also demonstrating where you have taken a stand against suggestions on the board matters that come up to you. And you also have to make sure people spend adequate time. Gone are the days when people could come for a short meeting and pass resolutions and approve matters of great importance. You need to have meetings. And for large listed companies, meetings of 2 days for every quarter, I think is a norm. The first day to discuss about business strategy, changes, etc. And second day to look at the results of the audit committee and other committees, and to pass all the resolutions and decisions in a proper board meeting, and then to announce results to the shareholders and to the markets. The entire structure is something that has to be put in place. And also independent directors should have proper briefing, because they're outsiders. They don't have enough time, or don't spend enough time like insiders. They need to be educated constantly, briefed constantly. So every now and then they need a briefing, especially there should be an onboarding exercise, which is transparently laid down for independent directors. So when new directors come, there is an onboarding exercise, they learn what happens, they're kept up to date, etc. And every time something happens in the corporation, an email or explanation from the CEO to the board is extremely important to keep them abreast. Independent directors who learn about critical developments in the corporation to the media will understand how bad they feel, because they should hear it first when the corporation makes a media announcement in strict confidence before the media tells them what is happening in the company where they're on the board. Because being on the board, you should have the first right to information of all matters that are germane and all matters that could be put in the public domain later. And I think that's extremely critical for a board culture to develop. So I would end here by saying that I think is very important for succession planning to be there in every corporation, which is a fundamental duty of the board. and to make sure that the independent director composition, structure, processes is done. And the lead independent director, in case the chairman is an insider or a CEO, has to take up this responsibility and clearly demonstrate that to everybody. If we're able to do this, the possibilities of good corporate governance become very, very high. And trust and confidence in the investing public in the corporation becomes very high. Thank you very much.